Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Unseen Watcher. It had been a long week, but Emma and Alex had finally made it to the remote campsite they've been planning for months. Nestled deep in the woods, far from any civilization, the site was supposed to be their getaway, a break from the stresses of daily life, a weekend of quiet, of stars, of nature. The weather had been temperamental, with dark clouds rolling in as they set up camp, but they hadn't let it dampen their spirits. "Nothing a little rain can't fix," Emma said, flashing a grin at Alex as she hammered in the last tent stake. "Right? Besides, it'll make everything feel more isolated," Alex replied, trying to sound optimistic as the wind picked up. They had set up their tent at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by thick, looming trees. The forest stretched out in all directions, a dense wall of green that seemed to swallow the last hints of daylight. The air smelled fresh, earthy, but the storm clouds growing overhead promised rain soon. By the time they finished making camp, the first drops began to fall. It started slow but quickly turned into a torrential downpour. The sound of rain battering the canopy above was deafening, and the forest was soon engulfed in a thick mist. They huddled inside their tent, the warmth of a small campfire just outside the door the only comfort. "Well, this is cozy," Emma said, her voice barely audible over the rain. She pulled the blanket closer around her and leaned back, her eyes closed. "Yeah," Alex replied, trying to make light of it. "At least we don't have to worry about bears in the rain." The storm raged on, and as the night deepened, the world outside seemed to vanish. Only the rain, the wind, and the occasional crack of thunder filled the silence. Emma and Alex exchanged quiet jokes, trying to pass the time, but the sound of the storm was growing unsettling, almost unnaturally loud. Suddenly, a sharp, wet thud broke through their conversation. Emma froze, her eyes darting to the entrance of the tent. Alex, sensing her unease, glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "What was that?" Emma whispered. Alex held up a hand, silencing her. Outside, the wind howled, and the rain beat down with ferocity, but something was different. Through the veil of rain and mist, they heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps, heavy against the wet earth. They both tensed. "That's not an animal," Alex muttered under his breath. He grabbed a flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, peering out into the rain-soaked darkness. For a moment, they saw nothing but shadows in the distance, shrouded by the heavy downpour. But then, the sound came again. Footsteps, unmistakably human, and closer this time. The wet earth beneath the trees seemed to swallow the sound, but the steps were getting nearer, slow and purposeful. Alex's heart began to race. He gripped the flashlight harder. "Do you see anything?" Emma whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "No," Alex said, his voice tight. "But someone's out there." Another step. and then another. The sounds came closer still, slow and methodical. Alex's mind raced. Could it be another camper? A hiker who got lost in the storm? But then, a cold chill ran down his spine. This wasn't the sound of someone who was lost. These steps were deliberate, calculated. "Emma, stay inside," Alex whispered, already moving to unzip the tent fully. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at him. He stepped out into the rain, the cold droplets hitting his face. He shone the flashlight around, but the beam was swallowed by the thick mist, rendering the night almost pitch black. The footsteps stopped. Alex held his breath, the silence deafening. Then, a sharp inhale, heavy, labored breathing, broke the stillness. It was close, too close. "Alex," Emma called softly from inside the tent. Her voice quivered. "What's going on?" Alex turned back to the tent, but then he saw it. Faint, wet footprints leading up to their tent, the mud slick under the weight of the rain. The prints were human, unmistakably so, left by someone barefoot, or at least without shoes. The edges of each footprint were still fresh, as though they had just been made. He stepped back, his heart pounding. "Emma, there are footprints. Are you sure?" she called out. Her voice quivered with panic. Alex moved closer to the marks, his flashlight casting weak light over the muddy trail. There were no other signs of movement around them. No distant rustling or sounds of the forest creatures. Just the damp, oppressive quiet of the storm. He crouched down, his breath shaky, and traced a finger along one of the prints. It was deep and clear, too clear for it to be a mere trick of the rain. Someone had walked right up to their tent. "I don't know who's out there," Alex said, his voice low, "but we need to get inside." As he stepped back toward the tent, another noise cut through the rain, the unmistakable sound of something heavy shifting in the brush. It was followed by the sound of something dragging, scraping against the wet ground, as though something or someone was moving slowly, deliberately, toward them. Alex whipped around. The flashlight beam flickered. There was nothing there. "Alex?" Emma called again. There was an edge of fear in her voice now. "I'm coming," he replied. But just as he turned to run back to the tent, he heard something else. A voice, a whisper, low and unintelligible, as if the storm itself was speaking. He paused, straining to hear. The voice was getting louder. "Alex." Emma's voice was shaking now, urgent. "Stay inside, Emma," he yelled, his feet already moving faster toward the tent. But then, before he could reach the entrance, something grabbed his ankle, cold fingers wrapping tightly around him. He gasped, stumbling forward and looked down. There was nothing except the wet ground and the faintest outline of a figure in the rain. For a split second, he thought he saw something humanoid, a figure rising from the forest floor, half formed like a shadow. It was tall, unnaturally so, and there was a disturbing stillness to it, like it was waiting for him to notice. He shook his head, eyes wide with panic. and yanked his foot free, stumbling backward toward the tent. The pressure on his ankle was gone as quickly as it had come, but the whisper grew louder, more distinct. "You're not alone." Alex scrambled into the tent, nearly knocking over Emma in his haste. He zipped it shut behind him with shaking hands. "What is it? What happened?" Emma asked, eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," Alex gasped, out of breath. "Someone's out there, but I don't know who." The rain seemed to intensify, the noise deafening, as if the storm were somehow amplifying the tension that clung to the air. They both sat in stunned silence, unable to make sense of what had just happened. And then the whisper started again, faint but unmistakable. "You're not alone." This time, they knew it was coming from outside their tent, from the edge of the forest. And this time, the voice was unmistakable, human. They weren't alone. The footsteps started again. Story 2. The Cursed Lake. The rain began to fall steadily, tapping against the canopy of trees above as the group of friends set up their camp near the edge of the lake. The storm had been brewing all afternoon, dark clouds rolling in with an intensity that seemed to promise something more than just a summer shower. But the friends were unbothered. For months, they had been planning this camping trip, an escape from their hectic lives to spend a weekend in nature, away from the noise and distractions of the world. "Isn't this place beautiful?" Lisa said as she surveyed the surroundings, the dark lake stretching out before her, reflecting the dim light of the stormy sky. "Yeah, but it feels off, doesn't it?" Ryan replied, a slight unease in his voice as he glanced at the lake. It was known as Blackwood Lake, a place surrounded by rumors and whispered stories in the nearby town. The locals spoke of strange disappearances, of people who ventured too close to the water and were never seen again. But it was nothing more than local superstition, they had all assumed. Just stories to scare off curious outsiders. "Come on, you're not getting spooked by campfire tales, are you?" Mark joked, clapping Ryan on the back as he unloaded their gear. "This place is perfect for camping. Just look at the view." Despite Mark's reassurances, Ryan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The lake was unnaturally still, not a ripple in the water despite the growing wind and the promise of an impending storm. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. "Well, I'm ready to get the fire going," Emma said, pulling a stack of firewood from the pile. Her voice was cheerful, oblivious to the tension in the air. The group worked quickly, setting up their tents and preparing the campsite. But as the sky darkened and the storm began to descend with greater force, a strange tension settled over the lake. The first few drops of rain were light, but soon the storm intensified and the rain began to pour in sheets. It was the kind of rain that blurred everything around them, leaving the forest bathed in a veil of mist. "Should we wait this out?" Mark called to the group as the thunder rumbled overhead. "No point," Ryan replied, his voice tight. "We're already here. Let's just huddle under the tarp and keep the fire going." They gathered under the tarp and tried to make the best of it, but the atmosphere was oppressive. The rain was relentless, the wind howling through the trees, and yet there was an unsettling stillness to the lake. Ryan kept glancing over at it, noticing the way the water seemed to shimmer unnaturally, even though the wind was barely stirring the trees. The surface of the lake was undisturbed, as though it was somehow holding its breath, too. Suddenly, a sharp crack of thunder echoed through the air, so loud it made them all flinch. The storm seemed to rage even harder, and just as the intensity of the rain reached its peak, something caught Ryan's eye. He squinted through the downpour, and his breath caught in his throat. The surface of the lake, previously still, was now rippling in patterns that made no sense. The waves were moving in conflicting directions, the water moving as if something beneath it was pushing upward. "Look!" Ryan shouted, his voice cracking as he pointed toward the water. The others turned to look. At first, they thought it was the storm playing tricks on them, but as they watched, the ripples grew larger, more violent. The water seemed to bubble and churn, as though something was rising from the depths. "What the hell?" Emma gasped, stepping closer to the edge of the tarp. "Stay back," Mark ordered, but his voice was unsteady too. He, too, was mesmerized by the growing disturbance in the lake. Then, as if in response to the storm's fury, a figure began to emerge from the water. At first, it was just a vague shape, an outline barely visible beneath the turbulent surface. But as the figure rose higher, it became unmistakable, a human form drenched in dark water, a face twisted in an agonizing grimace. The figure's limbs were stretched unnaturally, long and thin, covered in waterlogged clothes that clung to its skeletal frame. The figure's eyes were wide open, but they were blank, empty. The skin on its face had the pallor of someone who had been submerged for far too long, its hair matted and clinging to its skull. It seemed to float above the water, an impossible apparition, its body rising from the depths with an eerie grace, as if it were drawn upward by some invisible force. "Oh my God," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring storm. Before anyone could react, the figure lurched forward, its arms reaching out, fingers twisting toward them with an unnatural speed. The friends froze, unable to look away as the drowned figure's body creaked and shifted. Its outstretched hand seemed to beckon them, and in the thickening mist, the rain started to fall even harder, blurring their vision. Suddenly, the figure spoke, its voice gurgling, as though it were underwater. "Help me." The words were barely discernible, but the terror in the voice was unmistakable. It echoed through the storm, seeming to come from every direction. "Help me." Ryan's heart raced, and he instinctively took a step back. He couldn't look away, though. His feet felt rooted to the spot, his body frozen in place. The figure's hand continued to stretch toward them, and then, as if by some terrible magic, it seemed to move closer, the water now splashing violently around it as it reached further and further from the lake. "Run!" Mark shouted, suddenly snapping out of his trance. He grabbed Ryan by the arm and yanked him toward the campfire. "Run!" The friends scrambled, hearts pounding as they rushed toward their tents. But the storm had grown so intense, the rain so thick that they could barely see. The figure in the lake had not stopped. It was moving now, its limbs jerking, rising further out of the water as though it was coming for them. Each movement slow but inexorable. "Run, damn it!" Emma screamed, her voice high with panic. Ryan could feel the figure's presence behind him, its gaze boring into the back of his head, as though it were reaching out with some malevolent force, trying to pull him back toward the water. The group rushed past the campfire, the heat from the flames almost too bright against the chaos of the storm. But when they looked back, the figure was no longer in the lake. It had moved onto the shore, its body slick with water, its limbs dragging across the wet ground. The friends stumbled toward the safety of the trees, slipping in the mud and tripping over rocks, but they couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was always just behind them. They could hear the gurgling voice calling out again, louder this time, the words repeating in a twisted, dissonant chant. "Help me, help me." Finally, they reached a small clearing, and Emma turned to look back. She screamed when she saw it. A thin, gnarled hand emerging from the dark forest, dragging itself along the ground, followed by the grotesque figure, its face distorted in a permanent scream of torment. "This place is cursed," Ryan shouted, his voice hoarse as he tried to catch his breath. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But as they turned to flee, the storm suddenly stopped, and an oppressive silence descended over the lake and the forest. The rain ceased, and the wind died down as quickly as it had begun. When they looked back, the figure was gone. The lake was still again. The storm had vanished. The friends stood in shock, staring at the water, unsure of what to make of the experience. Was it real? Had they all imagined it? But deep down, they knew it wasn't just a storm. The curse of Blackwood Lake was real, and it was still waiting for its next victim. They never spoke of the incident again, but none of them ever returned to the lake. Some things they knew were better left undisturbed. The curse was still there, and it would always call to them from the depths of the lake. Story 3. The Rain That Repeats. Ben had always enjoyed camping. There was something about the solitude of the woods, the crackle of a campfire, and the quiet of the night that brought him peace. But this trip, he thought as he sat by the flickering flame, might be his last. He had driven for hours to reach this remote spot in the forest, deep in the heart of the mountains, far from the city. No cell signal, no distractions, just the woods and his thoughts. The weather had been fickle all day, and now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the storm clouds began to roll in. The distant rumble of thunder echoed through the trees. Ben had hoped the storm would pass quickly, but it only seemed to grow stronger. By the time he had finished setting up his tent and unpacking his gear, the first drops of rain began to fall, slow at first, but quickly building to a torrential downpour. The rain hit the leaves overhead with a deafening rhythm, and the wind howled through the trees, sending waves of cold air crashing against him. It felt as if the forest itself was alive, shuddering with the force of the storm. Ben pulled his jacket tighter around himself and retreated into the shelter of his tent, where the noise of the storm was muffled. He lay on his sleeping bag, watching the rain fall in sheets, his thoughts drifting. The storm outside seemed to match the unease that had been gnawing at him ever since he set up camp. It wasn't just the storm, it was something about the forest itself. There was an unnatural quality to the place, as if the trees and the land were older than anything he had known. Ben tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered. He closed his eyes, listening to the storm rage outside, and tried to fall asleep. The next thing Ben knew, he was waking up to the sound of raindrops hitting the tent again. His eyes snapped open, and for a moment, he just lay there disoriented. The storm was still howling, but something felt different. The rain was louder, somehow closer. Ben sat up and checked his watch. The time was 10:42 p.m., exactly the same as it had been when he had fallen asleep. Must have dozed off, he muttered to himself, rubbing his face. But then, he realized something that made his stomach tighten with unease. The storm hadn't stopped. He'd been awake when the rain began. It had stopped for a moment, and now it had started again. But this time, it was even worse than before, the wind shrieking and the rain battering the tent like it was trying to tear it apart. Ben unzipped the tent and crawled outside, feeling the weight of the damp air settle on him. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches creaking under the pressure. The rain was falling in sheets, the kind of rain that made the world feel like it was underwater. He squinted against the wind and peered into the dark woods. The storm had enveloped everything, turning the world into a blurry smear of water and shadow. Just a heavy storm, he muttered. Nothing to be afraid of, but something about the storm's intensity felt wrong, like it had grown far too violent in too short a time. A strange pressure built in the air, and Ben couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The wind howled louder, and just as quickly, it seemed to stop. In the sudden stillness, Ben felt a chill run down his spine. The storm had stopped, but it was still there, lingering just beyond his perception, waiting. He heard its footsteps, quiet at first, almost imperceptible, but then growing louder and more deliberate. Someone or something was moving through the trees, and the sound was coming closer. Ben's heart began to race. He spun around, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The forest stood eerily still. The footsteps ceased. Then the rain started again, falling as hard as before, washing over him in a cold, relentless rush. Shaking, Ben rushed back to his tent, barely managing to zip it up before the storm completely enveloped him. His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling. What had just happened? He tried to calm himself, telling himself it was nothing, that he'd just imagined it. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. His instincts told him that the storm wasn't just a storm. It was something else, something ancient. And just as he started to drift back to sleep, the familiar sound of raindrops filled the air once more. Ben woke up again, and the rain was falling, just as it had before. But this time, the storm was even more violent. He had no idea how long he had been asleep, but the storm had only grown stronger, the wind screeching like the cries of 1,000 souls. His watch glowed in the dark. 10:42 p.m. He froze. No, this wasn't right. Ben sat up quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. The rain was falling harder than ever, and the wind was so loud it shook the trees. The storm had reset itself. Again, panic gripped him as he scrambled to his feet. He glanced outside, but it was the same, impossibly dark, the rain still pelting the earth like 1,000 needles. The trees were swaying violently, the wind shrieking like a living thing. He reached for the zipper of his tent and pulled it open, rushing outside. But something was different this time. The atmosphere was heavier, suffocating. The trees were bending under the strength of the wind, their leaves rustling like whispers. Ben's breath caught in his throat as his eyes flicked over the landscape, scanning for any sign of movement. And there it was, a figure in the trees. At first, he thought it was a trick of the storm, a shadow cast by the branches. But then it moved, shifting between the trees with an unnatural fluidity. It was tall, far too tall for a person. Its form was dark and shifting, like a silhouette made from smoke and shadows. Ben stumbled backward, fear coursing through his veins. He turned to run back to the tent, but as he did, another figure appeared, this one closer, just outside the camp. Its eyes were glowing faintly, a sickly yellow light that cut through the rain. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Ben's breath caught in his throat as the rain began to fall harder, the wind growing even more violent. This was no ordinary storm, and he was no longer alone. Ben woke up again. The same storm, the same rain, the same terrifying figures lurking in the shadows. His heart raced as he checked his watch. 10:42 p.m. The time was the same. The night was repeating. The figures in the woods were closer now, so close that he could feel their presence like a cold weight pressing against him. His body was drenched in sweat and fear as he realized the truth. He was trapped in a time loop, each night resetting itself with the same storm, the same terror. He couldn't escape, and the shadowy figures were getting closer. Every time the storm reset, the creatures, shadowy, otherworldly beings, grew nearer, more tangible, more dangerous. Ben had tried everything. He'd tried to leave, but the forest always turned him back, the trees closing in around him as if the land itself were holding him in place. With every loop, the storm grew more violent. The wind howled harder, the rain became more torrential, and the figures became more real. They moved closer every time, their eyes glowing, their footsteps heavy and deliberate, echoing through the trees. Ben couldn't run anymore. He couldn't hide. He had to face them. As the rain poured down once more, he stood at the center of his campsite, the wind screaming around him. The figures were almost upon him now. Their eyes burned with an unholy fire, their shapes no longer shifting, no longer shadows. They were real, monstrous, dark shapes that towered over him. Ben could feel their cold breath on his skin, the terrifying weight of their presence closing in. The storm was reaching its peak, and as the rain lashed down around him, Ben realized he couldn't outrun this. He wasn't meant to. He was a part of the loop now, and the storm would never stop. Story 4. The Wet Footprints. It had been one of those camping trips that felt like it would go down in history as a classic adventure, the kind of story you'd tell for years. At least, that's what Jack, Sarah, and Greg had all assumed as they made their way deep into the forest for a weekend of hiking and camping. They were seasoned campers, familiar with the woods, familiar with the kind of wild things that could happen when you venture far from civilization. But nothing could have prepared them for what they would encounter that weekend. The rain had started in the late afternoon, heavy and relentless, as if the heavens had been holding back their fury for days, waiting for the perfect moment to release it. The trio had taken shelter under the large tarp they set up for just such an occasion. The campfire now nothing but a sullen pile of smoke and dying embers beneath the shelter. They sat around the edge of the tarp, sipping on hot cocoa and talking quietly, the rhythmic sound of the rain masking the world around them. The storm raged through the night, and by morning, the forest was thick with mist. The trees stood shrouded in a ghostly white fog, the air damp and cool, the ground slick with the remnants of last night's rain. "We're not going to get anywhere if we just sit here all day," Greg said, peering out at the mist-shrouded forest. "We might as well go for that hike we planned." "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, looking at the gray sky. "It looks like the storm's still holding on." Jack, ever the optimist, shrugged. "The storm's passed. We might as well go for a walk while the rain's light. It's not like we have much else to do." The decision was made, and they packed up their gear, pulling on their rain jackets and boots. They decided to take the trail that wound through the deeper part of the forest, a route that Jack had heard about from locals but had never ventured on himself. He promised the others it would be worth it. The trail led to a hidden waterfall, a perfect reward for a good hike. They trekked through the wet forest, the ground squelching beneath their boots, their breath misting in the cold air. The rain had lessened, but the forest was still dripping, every leaf and branch heavy with water. As they walked, the scent of wet earth and moss filled their lungs, the sound of the distant waterfall growing louder with every step. By mid-afternoon, they found themselves at a small clearing, just beyond the base of the waterfall. They had a perfect view of the water cascading down the rocks, creating a mist that shimmered in the dim light. The mist from the waterfall hung in the air like a fine spray, and the world felt oddly serene, until Jack saw the first strange sign. "Hey," Jack called, stepping closer to the waterfall. "What's that?" Sarah and Greg turned to see what he was pointing at. At the edge of the clearing, just at the edge of the forest, the ground was disturbed, dark, wet footprints. But these weren't ordinary footprints. They were large, too large, and left a strange, deep imprint in the soft mud, as if they had been made by something much heavier than a person. "Those look fresh," Greg said, squatting down to inspect the tracks. "The rain hasn't had time to wash them away yet." Sarah's gaze wandered from the prints and over to the dark forest beyond. Something about the sight of the tracks made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "We should stay close," Sarah said, her voice tense. "Something about this doesn't feel right." Jack stood up, examining the tracks more closely. "I've never seen footprints like these. They're too wide, and they're not human. Look at the shape of the toes. These could be from some kind of animal, but they're not like anything I've seen around here." Without warning, the wind picked up again, sending a cold chill through the clearing. The fog seemed to thicken, closing in on them. The faint sounds of the waterfall were drowned out by the howling wind, and a strange pressure filled the air. "We should follow them," Greg suggested. "See where they go." "Are you serious?" Sarah asked. "Those could be dangerous." "It's just footprints," Jack said. "Let's follow them for a bit. Maybe we'll find out what made them." The group hesitated for a moment, but their curiosity got the better of them. They decided to follow the strange footprints, stepping carefully over the wet ground. The tracks led them deeper into the forest, the air growing colder as they went. The deeper they ventured, the more unnerving the forest became. The trees seemed to grow thicker and closer together, their trunks twisting like ancient fingers reaching toward the sky. The ground grew slicker, the dampness of the earth seeping into their boots, and the air was thick with an otherworldly silence. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After a few minutes, the tracks began to change. The wetness in the footprints started to spread, growing larger and thicker. It wasn't just water anymore. It was as though the moisture had taken on a life of its own, pooling around the footprints like a strange, dark liquid. Jack stopped, his gaze fixed on the ground ahead. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing. The others leaned in. The footprints were now larger, more pronounced, and the dark liquid that seeped from them was pooling into a small trail leading deeper into the woods. It wasn't rainwater, not anymore. It was dark, almost black, and the ground around the footprints seemed to be absorbing the liquid, making it grow darker with every step. "Let's turn back," Sarah urged, her voice low with a sense of dread. But it was too late. From the direction of the footprints, a sound echoed, soft at first, like something brushing against the leaves. But then it grew louder, as if something or someone was moving quickly through the underbrush. "Did you hear that?" Greg whispered, his hand gripping his knife instinctively. Before anyone could answer, the sound stopped. The forest fell silent again, but now there was something else, something that had changed the atmosphere entirely. The air had thickened, and an unnatural chill hung around them, pressing in from all sides. Jack stepped forward, his eyes scanning the trees ahead. "We need to keep going." But as he stepped forward, something caught his foot. a thin, slippery tendril of moss, or so he thought. He stumbled forward, catching himself on the nearest tree, and then he saw it. From the shadows of the trees, the first figure emerged. It was tall, much taller than a human, its shape indistinct but covered in a slick, wet substance that glistened in the faint light of the forest. Its eyes were nothing but dark holes, black, empty voids that stared into Jack's soul. The figure moved with an eerie, unnatural speed, its limbs long and twisted, leaving behind the trail of dark, wet footprints. "Run!" Jack yelled, his voice barely a whisper. The trio turned, bolting back toward the clearing, but the forest seemed to shift around them. The wetness in the air was no longer just rain. It had become something else. The trees seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing in sync with the figure that now pursued them. The wet footprints had begun to spread, reaching out from the trees themselves. The dark liquid seeped from the roots of the trees, pooling in the earth and growing larger with every step they took. They could hear the footsteps of the creature, louder now, closer, faster, growing with each passing moment. They raced back to the clearing, but when they reached it, the mist had thickened and the trees seemed to close in around them, trapping them in a dark, suffocating circle. The dark liquid spread across the ground, and as they tried to find a way out, they realized the trees had become an inescapable maze. The creature's presence was everywhere now, the ground pulsing beneath their feet, the trees creaking as though they were alive. They were no longer in the same forest they had entered. The familiar path was gone. The footprints, the wetness that had started in the forest, were everywhere now, as though they were inside a nightmare that was spiraling out of control. The forest had claimed them, and the creature's pursuit was inevitable. As the wet footprints spread and the shadows closed in, Jack, Sarah, and Greg realized that they were not merely lost. They were being hunted by something ancient, something that had always been there, lurking in the heart of the forest. And it was no longer satisfied with the dark liquid on the ground. It wanted them next. The trees whispered, the wetness seeping closer as the creature closed in. Story 5. The Stolen Tent. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Claire had been looking forward to the camping trip for weeks. She loved the outdoors, the crisp, fresh air, the sounds of nature, and the quiet solitude that came with being deep in the woods. She had planned everything down to the last detail. The perfect spot by the creek, a sturdy tent, her favorite camping gear, and enough food and supplies for a few days of peace. The rain started just after nightfall, a steady downpour that made the forest feel even more alive. The sound of it beating against the canopy above created a soothing rhythm, and Claire, wrapped in her warm sleeping bag, had no trouble falling asleep. She knew that the weather forecast had predicted rain, but she hadn't let it deter her. It was just a little rain, after all, and it wouldn't last long. But when she woke the next morning, the world felt different. The first thing Claire noticed when she opened her eyes was the eerie silence. The rain had stopped, but something was off. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, were conspicuously absent. She stretched, wiping sleep from her eyes, and then froze in disbelief. Her tent was gone. The familiar, cozy structure she had set up the previous night, her safe little bubble in the wilderness, was completely absent. Claire sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. At first, she thought maybe it had been blown away by the wind or washed out by the rain, but no. She could see no signs of her tent anywhere in the immediate vicinity. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. Panic began to creep into her mind. She quickly threw on her rain jacket and stepped outside, scanning the area around her campsite. The forest was thick and dense, and the visibility was poor from the mist that still clung to the trees. She took a few cautious steps forward, hoping to catch a glimpse of her tent somewhere on the horizon. But there was nothing. The more Claire searched, the more her worry deepened. She retraced her steps, moving cautiously through the mud-soaked ground, checking every nook and cranny, but still no sign of the tent. How could it have disappeared? It wasn't like it could just vanish. Someone must have taken it. But who? And why? Claire stood there, motionless, trying to steady her breathing. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Maybe it was a prank, though it seemed highly unlikely that someone would be camping out here with her. The area was remote, far from the nearest trailhead, and the only people she knew of who were in the area were a group of backpackers she passed by on the way in. Long gone by now, probably miles away by the time the storm had hit. As she stood there, gazing helplessly around the forest, she heard something in the distance, a sound that wasn't quite right. It was faint at first, almost like the wind rustling through the trees. But as she focused, she realized it was something else. It sounded like footsteps? No, it was too rhythmic for that. More like the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. The noise grew louder, coming from deeper in the forest. She didn't wait to see what it was. Claire's instincts kicked in, and she immediately started running in the direction of the noise, heart pounding in her chest. The mud splashed beneath her boots as she pushed her way through the underbrush. The sound grew louder and louder until, suddenly, she saw it. Her tent. It was standing there, perfectly set up, like nothing had happened. The white nylon walls were taut and undisturbed. The door zipped tightly shut. It was as if the tent had simply been moved, intact, untouched, and whole. Claire's stomach twisted in disbelief. How was this even possible? With shaking hands, she moved toward the tent, her footsteps sloshing through the wet ground. She reached for the zipper and pulled it open, but when she looked inside, her breath caught in her throat. The inside of the tent was a nightmare. The floor, which had been clean and dry the night before, was covered in dark, sticky mud. It had seeped into every corner, coating the fabric, the gear, and the sleeping bag. Claire recoiled, her eyes scanning the interior in shock. It didn't make sense. How could mud have gotten in here? It hadn't been raining that hard during the night. And then she saw the note. It was written in dark, smeared ink, and it was tucked neatly into the corner of her sleeping bag, almost as if someone had placed it there intentionally. Claire's hands trembled as she picked it up. The note was short, but its meaning was chilling. "You're not welcome here." A chill ran down Claire's spine as she read the words. The note didn't make sense. She had been alone here the entire time, aside from those other backpackers who had long since passed. So, who had left it for her, and why? The forest was silent again, the stillness almost suffocating. Claire felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as the weight of the situation hit her. She was no longer just dealing with a missing tent. She was dealing with something far more sinister. Someone had been watching her. Someone had taken her tent and moved it, and now they were leaving her messages. But who? And what did they want? Her first instinct was to pack up and leave, to head straight back to the car and never look back. But something in the pit of her stomach told her that wasn't going to be enough. Whoever, or whatever, had done this, they were still out there, and Claire wasn't sure if they would let her go that easily. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Claire stood frozen, her mind racing. She knew she needed to get out, but the fear that gripped her legs made it impossible to move. The air had grown unnervingly still again, and she couldn't help but feel as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Suddenly, she heard a rustle from the nearby bushes. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of something moving in the underbrush. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't alone. Claire didn't wait to find out who or what it was. Adrenaline surged through her body, and in a moment of sheer panic, she grabbed her pack and bolted toward the edge of the forest, ignoring the mud that slowed her steps. She had to get out of there, away from the tent, away from whatever was lurking in the trees. As she stumbled through the undergrowth, she could still hear the rustling, the footsteps that followed her. No matter how fast she ran, it was as if something was just behind her, always there, never quite close enough to catch her, but close enough to remind her of its presence. After what felt like an eternity of running, Claire finally broke through the trees and emerged into the open clearing where she had first set up camp. But when she looked back, her tent was gone again, vanished without a trace. The forest was still, silent, as if nothing had happened. For the rest of the day, Claire stayed at the edge of the forest, too terrified to venture back inside. When night fell, she made a hasty decision. She would leave. She wasn't sure if the fear was more about what was out there or what had happened to her tent, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't welcome here, and whoever or whatever had stolen her tent, had left the note, and had followed her. They would be waiting for her if she ever came back. Story 6. The Rain of Eyes. When Emily and Jack decided to go camping that weekend, they were looking forward to a peaceful retreat from their busy lives. They had been working tirelessly for months, Jack with his new startup and Emily with her career as an architect. And the thought of escaping into the deep woods, away from the incessant noise of the city, seemed like the perfect solution. They found an isolated spot along a quiet stream, a few miles from the nearest hiking trail, and set up their tent just as the sun began to set. The day had been gorgeous: blue skies, warm temperatures, and a gentle breeze. They spent the evening sitting by the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking, enjoying the natural beauty around them. But as night fell, the weather changed. A distant rumble of thunder echoed through the mountains, and the peaceful night sky grew overcast. By the time they were lying inside the tent, the rain had begun to fall steadily. Emily was lying on her back, staring at the ceiling of the tent, the steady sound of rain pattering on the canvas above her. It was a comforting noise, one that had always helped her sleep during storms. Jack, on the other hand, was tossing and turning. He'd always been a light sleeper, and the noise of the rain kept him awake despite his exhaustion. "Are you still awake?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. Jack turned his head toward her, his face illuminated by the faint light of a lantern. "Yeah, I just can't sleep. It's like the rain is getting louder and louder." Emily chuckled softly. "It's just the storm. It's probably just the wind making it sound worse than it is." But Jack didn't seem convinced. His eyes flickered toward the tent wall, where the raindrops were hitting, each one creating a tiny splash as it landed. Emily followed his gaze, and that's when she noticed something odd. The raindrops weren't just falling. They seemed to form strange, almost symmetrical patterns on the tent. At first, she thought it was her imagination playing tricks on her in the low light. But as she stared longer, she realized that the droplets weren't just random. They were forming shapes. Small, round shapes that looked unnervingly like eyes. She blinked, then rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. But when she looked again, the droplets were still there, clustered together in pairs or groups, perfectly shaped like eyes. They were small at first, but as the storm intensified, they began to grow more distinct. Each droplet became a dark, round eye, and as the rain continued to pour, the eyes multiplied, covering the entire tent. It was as if they were staring back at her. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "What?" Jack muttered, still restless. "There are the eyes on the tent. Look." Jack turned his head and looked at the wall of the tent. At first, he saw nothing unusual, but as the rain came down harder, the droplets began to take form, as if the very fabric of the tent had transformed into something alive. The eyes blinked, slowly, deliberately. "Holy shit," Jack gasped, sitting up suddenly. "What is this?" Emily didn't know how to respond. She felt a chill race down her spine as she continued to watch the eyes. They weren't just stationary, they were moving, shifting from one place to another, following the contours of the tent like they were tracking her movements. "Okay, this is freaky," Jack muttered. He tried to pull the zipper open, but the rain was coming down so hard now that the air felt thick with moisture, and the fabric of the tent felt wet and sticky against his fingers. "Maybe we should leave," Emily suggested, her voice high with panic. She wasn't sure if she was more terrified of the rain itself or the strange, unblinking eyes that seemed to be watching her. But before they could do anything, something else happened. The eyes began to move again, but this time it wasn't random. They moved in unison, as if they were responding to something beyond the physical world. The raindrops began to pulse like a rhythmic heartbeat, and the eyes started to whisper. At first, the whispers were quiet, soft murmurs that seemed to come from all directions at once. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make out the words. Embrace the darkness. A voice hissed from the eyes nearest her. Run away. Another voice whispered, this one far more desperate. It's too late. You can't escape, a third voice muttered. Emily's breath quickened as the whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from eerie to threatening. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt dry and tight, as if something invisible was choking her. The eyes seemed to press closer and closer to the tent, their forms now vivid and intense, glowing in the dark with a faint, sickly light. Jack, she gasped, her voice strained with fear. They're talking to us. Jack's face was pale. He couldn't take his eyes off the eyes on the tent wall, nor could he explain what was happening. It was as if the rain, once so calming, had turned into something malevolent, something alive and sinister. The eyes were not just watching. They were alive, aware of them, and they seemed to be probing the deepest recesses of their minds. Then it got worse. The whispers were no longer just incoherent words. The eyes began to speak specific secrets, things no one but Emily and Jack knew. The voices seemed to read their thoughts, their fears, their most intimate moments. The rain didn't just carry the sound of the storm now. It carried their secrets, spoken back to them in a chilling, otherworldly chorus. I know what you did last summer, a voice cooed, echoing in Emily's ears. Jack, she knows. She knows everything. Another voice echoed back at him. The whispers grew louder, more intense, until the whole tent seemed to reverberate with them, the fabric trembling under the weight of their words. Emily shook her head, unable to stop the flood of memories and thoughts that were being dragged into the open. The things she had buried, the things she hadn't even told Jack, now spilled into the air, exposed in the most unnerving way. It's all your fault, the voice rasped. Jack's eyes widened in horror. No, this isn't real. This can't be happening. But it was, and it was growing worse with each passing second. The eyes moved faster now, the rain louder, as though the entire world around them had become a canvas for some kind of dark force. The whispers shifted, growing more specific, more pointed. You'll never escape, one voice crooned. The eyes are watching, another whispered. Emily covered her ears, but the voices still managed to penetrate her thoughts, slipping through the cracks like smoke, impossible to block out. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The rain ceased. The whispers fell silent. The eyes vanished. For a moment, the forest outside the tent was still. The air was thick and heavy, and Emily and Jack could barely breathe, their chests tight with fear. The only sound now was the distant rustling of trees as the storm moved on. Emily slowly lifted her hands from her ears, her heart still pounding in her chest. She dared to glance at the walls of the tent, expecting the eyes to be back. But there was nothing. The tent was just a tent again. The fabric was soaked, but the rain had stopped. The eyes, the whispers, the terror. It was gone. Jack didn't speak. Neither of them moved. The only evidence of what had just occurred was the lingering sense of dread in the air, the weight of those words, those secrets. Neither of them could speak to what had happened, what they had experienced. They waited in the silence, unsure of what to do next, but both knowing one thing. They had just witnessed something beyond their understanding, something dark and ancient, and whatever it was, they weren't supposed to have encountered it. And the rain, it would come again. Story 7, the tornadic ghost. The storm had come out of nowhere. 1 minute, the sky was a brilliant blue, dotted with a few harmless clouds. The next, it darkened with unnatural speed. The campers at Lake Durden had no warning, no hint of the nightmare that was about to descend upon them. The weather was typically unpredictable in these parts, but they hadn't anticipated something this violent. They were deep in the forest, nestled near the shore of a lake that had long been a popular camping spot. The sound of wind picking up didn't alarm them at first, but it wasn't long before the storm turned savage. The wind came howling through the trees, whipping branches like fragile twigs. The temperature plummeted as dark clouds churned overhead, and the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, it was a torrential downpour, and the sound of rain hitting the forest canopy was deafening. But then, above the roar of the storm, there was another sound, a low, rumbling growl in the distance, like the earth itself was groaning under some unseen pressure. Liam, the group's unofficial leader, scrambled to reinforce the tent stakes, shouting to his friends to secure everything. His voice was nearly drowned out by the thunder that cracked across the sky. Beside him, Rachel and Ethan struggled to keep their gear from being blown away. The wind was picking up in intensity, now howling so fiercely that the trees seemed to bend with each gust. "I think we should ride this out in the car," Rachel screamed, her voice shaking. But Liam shook his head. "No, we'll be fine. Just need to stay put. This is nothing compared to what we've been through." But as he spoke, the sky above them seemed to twist. The clouds had taken on a menacing green hue, and a low, unnerving pressure filled the air. A tornado was forming. He could feel it in his bones. Panic spread through the group as they realized the same thing. "Get to the shelter," Liam yelled, his voice barely audible now over the gale-force winds. But it was too late. Before they could make it to the relative safety of their car, the storm struck with unimaginable force. The world turned into a whirlwind of rain, wind, and chaos. The ground seemed to quake beneath their feet, and all they could do was hold on to whatever they could find to anchor themselves. The storm raged for what felt like hours, tearing at the tent, ripping through the trees. The sound of the wind was deafening, a monstrous roar that seemed to shake the very earth. Liam had never experienced anything like it. He could feel the pressure building, could see the sky twisting above them in unnatural ways. And then, as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was chilling. For a moment, the world seemed still. The winds had calmed. The storm had passed. Liam, Rachel, and Ethan slowly gathered themselves, their clothes soaked through, their bodies exhausted from the terror of the storm. But as they looked around, something didn't feel right. The forest, normally alive with the sounds of nature, was eerily silent. The storm had been so violent that even the birds and animals seemed to have fled. The air was thick with moisture, and the ground beneath their feet was slick with rainwater. "Is everyone okay?" Liam asked, his voice hoarse. "We're okay," Rachel replied, still shaking from the experience. "But what was that?" "I don't know," Liam said, "but we need to pack up and get out of here." Just as he spoke, something caught his eye. Out in the distance, near the trees by the edge of the clearing, something was standing. A figure. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, something distorted by the heavy rain and mist that clung to the forest. But as he looked closer, his stomach churned with unease. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, with a form that seemed to shimmer like smoke. It was drenched by the rain, but it didn't seem bothered by it. No, it wasn't just standing there. It was waiting, watching them. Its features were obscured, but there was something about it that made Liam's skin crawl. It was as if it didn't belong in the world they inhabited. The figure looked almost ghostly. "Do you see that?" Rachel whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Liam nodded, his heart pounding. The figure was standing still, like a statue, unmoving but undeniably present. It wasn't just the shape that unsettled them. It was the way it didn't seem to care about the storm. The rain that had soaked everything else in the forest seemed to pass through it as if it were made of mist. "Should we go over?" Ethan asked, his voice a mix of fear and curiosity. "No," Liam said, shaking his head. "We don't know what that is. Let's get out of here." But it was too late. The figure seemed to sense their hesitation. It moved. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a shock of fear through Liam's chest. Slowly, the figure began to glide toward them. No, not glide, walk. The footsteps were soundless, though the air seemed to grow heavier with each step it took. "I think we need to leave now," Rachel whispered. But the figure wasn't just walking. It was drawing closer, and as it did, Liam could see that its face, or what he thought was its face, was gaunt, hollow, almost skeletal, covered in tattered rags that hung from its shoulders like the remnants of a long-forgotten soul. Its eyes, when they looked at him, were black pits, empty but full of terrible, ancient knowledge. The presence of the figure was oppressive, like the weight of the storm was still hanging over them. The figure stopped a few feet away from them, and for a long moment, nothing happened. It stood motionless, like a statue carved from stone. The silence was oppressive, but then the figure's lips parted, and a voice, low, cold, and unearthly, whispered through the air. Betrayal, it rasped. The sound of the word was like a windstorm, its tone carrying the weight of centuries of sorrow. Revenge. Liam froze, his body rigid with fear. The figure's voice echoed through the clearing like the wind through the trees. And though it seemed to come from the ghost, it didn't seem like it was directed at them. The words hung in the air like a dark omen, their meaning heavy with a history neither of them understood. Who are you?" Rachel asked, her voice barely a whisper. The ghostly figure tilted its head, and for the first time, it seemed to acknowledge their presence. It took another slow step forward, and as it did, the rain began to fall again, though this time it wasn't the light drizzle from earlier. The storm was coming back, stronger than before. The wind began to howl once more, and the temperature dropped. The storm's fury, it seemed, was not finished. "I am the one who was left to die," the figure continued, its voice rising as the storm grew more intense, now carrying the weight of 1,000 years of anger. "I was betrayed, cast aside, and now I am bound to the winds, to the storm. I seek vengeance." With each word, the wind seemed to grow in strength. The trees began to creak and bend, as if the very forest itself was being forced to listen. The ghost's words were like a curse, speaking of a time long past, when someone had wronged it, left it to perish alone in a storm. And now it was trapped, bound to the eternal winds, doomed to haunt this forest for as long as the storm raged. Liam's heart pounded. "How do we stop it?" he asked, his voice cracking with fear. The figure's head tilted again, and it seemed to smile, though its face was little more than a collection of shadows. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it said, its voice like the howl of the wind. "The storm is my revenge, and it will never end." Suddenly, the air seemed to freeze, and then the storm surged to an unimaginable fury. The rain lashed out in sheets, the wind tearing at the trees, and the forest groaned under the weight of the rage that had been unleashed. The ghost stood there, motionless, its form becoming one with the storm. It wasn't just a specter anymore. It was the storm itself, the wind, the rain, the very fury of nature. Liam, Rachel, and Ethan didn't wait to see what would happen next. They turned and ran, their hearts racing with the terrible knowledge that the storm would not stop, that the spirit of betrayal and revenge would haunt them forever. The storm raged on, and the figure stood among the trees, its hollow eyes watching them as they fled, knowing that the winds would never cease. Story 8. The Lost Signal. The rain came down in torrents. It wasn't the kind of storm anyone expected when they had first set up camp. Liam and his friends, Rachel, Ethan, and Sarah, had been anticipating a quiet weekend in the wilderness, the kind where they could escape from their busy lives and enjoy the solitude of the forest. The forest was pristine, a place so remote that only the brave, or the foolish ventured this deep. But then the storm arrived, the sky darkening with ominous clouds, and the temperature plummeting to an unnatural chill. The wind had picked up quickly, snapping branches and sending leaves scattering across the muddy ground. A storm like this was rare, but not unheard of. At first, they had laughed it off, enjoying the adventure, even as the first few drops of rain began to fall. But soon, it became clear that this storm was different. The winds howled, and the thunder rumbled like an animal waking from a long slumber. The forest itself seemed to come alive, its trees creaking and groaning under the weight of the gale-force winds. As the rain began to pour harder, Sarah, the most cautious of the group, pulled out her phone. "I'm just checking the weather," she said, though she didn't seem convinced. The signal in the forest was notoriously weak, so they usually had no hope of getting a good connection, but she was persistent. She stood just outside their tent, trying to get any hint of a signal, her screen flickering between searching and no service. Liam shook his head. "It's no use, Sarah. We're in the middle of nowhere. The storm's cutting us off from the world." But then, just as she was about to put her phone down in frustration, the screen flickered one last time. A single bar appeared on the display, a weak signal, but a signal nonetheless. "Wait, I got something," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "There's a signal. It's coming in faintly, but I can hear something." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, hear something?" Before Sarah could answer, a low, crackling noise emanated from her phone, followed by a voice. The voice was distorted, the static making it hard to understand, but the message was unmistakable. Help me. I've been here for so long." The voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried a sense of desperate urgency that sent a chill down Liam's spine. He stepped closer, peering over Sarah's shoulder as the voice continued. Please, I don't have much time left. They're still here." "What the hell is this?" Rachel asked, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Is that real? Is someone really out there?" Sarah's hand trembled as she held the phone up, the voice growing clearer, but still distorted. The static roared in and out like a storm, matching the chaos outside their tent. I don't know, but that voice, it sounds like it's coming from the forest," Sarah whispered. Like they're close." Liam's heart started to race. They were deep in the wilderness, miles away from the nearest town. If someone was out there, stranded in this storm, they were in serious trouble. He glanced at his friends. "We need to go out there," he said, his voice low but firm. "No," Rachel said quickly, shaking her head. "We don't know what that is. What if it's some kind of prank? What if someone's messing with us?" But Ethan wasn't convinced. He leaned in, closer to Sarah's phone. "What if it's real? What if someone's actually out there and they're in danger? We can't just ignore this." The voice on the phone crackled again, but this time it sounded frantic. "Please, they're coming. They're coming for me. You have to help me, please. They won't stop. They won't stop until they get me." The signal dropped out suddenly, replaced by a loud burst of static. The phone went silent. Sarah stared at it in disbelief, her hand still clenched tightly around the device. "What the hell was that?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. "Well, what was that?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But that sounded real." Liam's stomach churned. There was something off about it, something he couldn't quite place. The voice had sounded too real, too desperate, but he wasn't sure if it was a prank or something worse, something much darker. "We can't just sit here," he said. "We need to find out where that's coming from. Someone might be out there, and we need to help." The storm had not let up. In fact, it seemed to be getting worse by the minute. The rain coming down harder, the wind howling like a wild animal trapped in a cage. The group hesitated, each of them knowing how dangerous it could be to venture out into the woods in such weather. But the uncertainty, the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong, pushed them forward. Liam grabbed his flashlight and motioned for the others to follow him. "Stay close," he ordered. "We don't know what's out there." They stumbled through the thick woods, their steps muffled by the sound of rain crashing onto the leaves and the deafening wind. The forest seemed to close in around them as they walked, the trees bending and swaying like living things, their branches creaking and groaning in protest against the storm. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine, and the only light they had came from Liam's flashlight, which barely cut through the darkness. The deeper they went, the more unsettled they felt. The voice on the phone kept echoing in their minds, and each of them couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Something was out there, something that had been waiting for them. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing. It was eerily quiet now, the storm's fury still raging but somehow muted, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. In the middle of the clearing stood an old, weather-beaten shack, half destroyed by the years and the storms. Its windows were dark, and the door hung ajar, swaying gently in the wind. Liam's pulse quickened. This was it, the source of the signal. He approached the shack cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The others followed, their footsteps soft against the wet ground. As they neared the door, they could hear something faint, a soft creaking noise like a door opening. The voice on Sarah's phone crackled again, but this time it wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from inside the shack. "Help me," the voice moaned. "Help me, please, they're coming." Liam didn't hesitate. He pushed open the door, and the group stepped inside. The air was damp, musty, the smell of old wood and decay thick in the air. The interior was dark, with only the faintest slivers of light cutting through the cracks in the walls. "Hello," Liam called, his voice shaky but strong. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer, just the eerie sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. And then they saw it. In the far corner of the shack, crouched beneath a pile of old debris, was a figure. At first, it seemed to be hunched, its back turned to them. But as they moved closer, they saw the shape more clearly, and their hearts froze in their chests. The figure was a man. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes were wide with terror, and as they locked eyes with Liam, he opened his mouth, but no sound came out, just a faint, rattling breath. Suddenly, he lurched forward, a frantic, desperate movement. His lips parted, but the words that came out were garbled, a whisper that was barely audible. "They're coming," he rasped. They're still here. They never left." Before Liam could ask what he meant, the storm outside began to intensify. The shack seemed to shake, the walls creaking and groaning in protest. The air grew cold, and the figure before them suddenly went silent, his eyes hollow and lost. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the voice stopped. The storm outside faded, and with it, the figure in the corner disappeared, vanished into thin air. The shack was empty. The signal on Sarah's phone went dead. The group stood there, frozen, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The storm outside had passed, but the terror they felt remained, lingering in the silence. They never spoke of the lost signal again, but each of them knew the truth. They had heard something real that night, a warning, or perhaps a curse, and something or someone was still out there, waiting for them. Story 9. The Forgotten Campground. The rain came down in relentless sheets, drenching the forest as if it were washing away something deep within its roots. Liam, Sarah, Ethan, and Rachel had been hiking for hours, the trail winding deeper into the wilderness, away from the familiar world they had known. The storm had taken them by surprise. At first, it had seemed like a light drizzle, but now it was a downpour, the kind that soaked to the bone and left no shelter dry. They had lost track of time, caught up in the beauty of the forest, until the storm hit with such fury that they could hardly see in front of them. "Are we lost?" Rachel asked, her voice tinged with nervousness as she tried to shield her face from the rain. The gusts of wind were fierce, tearing through the trees and bending them in unnatural directions. "I don't think so," Ethan said, trying to steady himself as he wiped the rain from his eyes. "The map says there's a campground up ahead. We just need to push through a little further." Liam squinted through the downpour, barely able to see through the thick fog that had settled in. "There's no way we're getting to the next shelter in this weather," he said. "We need to find somewhere to hunker down for the night." The group trudged on, slipping and sliding through the mud as the rain intensified. After what felt like an eternity, they saw a break in the trees, a clearing ahead. In the center of the clearing, almost obscured by the storm, stood a dilapidated sign that read Campsite 12. "Finally," Sarah said, relief in her voice as they approached the site. But when they arrived, something felt off. The area was strangely quiet, and the campsite seemed abandoned. The tents and fire rings that usually characterize the site were overgrown with weeds and moss. Old wooden picnic tables were warped, their surfaces cracked and peeling, and the fire pit in the center of the campground was cold, as if it had been left alone for years. There were no other signs of life, no campers, no vehicles, just an eerie stillness. "I thought this place was supposed to be active," Rachel murmured, looking around with uncertainty. "This doesn't look like any campground I've ever seen." Liam nodded, scanning the area. "Yeah, it's definitely off. But we don't have much choice, do we? The storm's not letting up." Reluctantly, the group began to set up their tents, each of them feeling a growing sense of unease as they moved about the site. The storm continued to rage, the wind howling through the trees and the rain pouring down in torrents. It felt as if they were trapped in some kind of vacuum, with no escape. As they worked, Sarah wandered over to the fire pit. The stones surrounding it were charred, and the remains of a half-done fire lay scattered around the base. But there was something strange about it. The fire had been abandoned mid-burn, the logs only partially consumed, as if someone had left in the middle of tending to it. "Does this look weird to anyone else?" she asked, crouching down beside it. Liam walked over and knelt beside her, frowning as he inspected the remains. "It's like someone was here not long ago. The fire's still warm, but no one's around. Maybe we're not the first to get caught in this storm," Rachel suggested, her voice lacking conviction. She turned away from the fire, shivering in the cold, but the unease didn't leave them. As they set up the rest of the camp, the wind howled even louder, whipping the trees into a frenzy. It felt as if the forest itself was alive, shifting and groaning with the storm. The rain fell heavier, and the shadows between the trees grew deeper. The campsite seemed to close in on them. Once they had set up, they huddled inside their tents to wait out the storm, hoping for some respite. But even as they tried to relax, they couldn't shake the sense of being watched. It wasn't a sound that could be pinpointed. No footsteps, no voices, just an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional crash of thunder or the howling wind. Then, as the storm intensified, they began to hear it, a faint whisper. It was so quiet at first that they weren't sure if they had heard it at all. But then it came again, a soft, insistent murmur, as though someone or something was speaking directly into their minds. Liam, it was his name. Liam's blood ran cold, and he immediately looked around, his heart hammering in his chest. But there was no one outside his tent. The rain pelted against the fabric like 1,000 tiny hammers, but the whisper had come from somewhere nearby. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice shaky as he turned to Rachel, Ethan, and Sarah. "Hear what?" Rachel asked, looking up from her book, her face pale. "What do you mean?" "It sounded like someone called my name," Liam said, his breath coming out in short bursts. It was like a whisper, but it wasn't like the wind. It felt real. Ethan frowned, glancing around the dark, rain-soaked campsite. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on you, but Liam wasn't so sure. The voice had been too clear, too personal. Another whisper broke the silence. "Rachel." It was softer this time, but unmistakably clear. Rachel's face went pale, and she immediately sat up in her tent. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did you hear it?" Liam nodded. "That's what I've been hearing. It's like someone's trying to get our attention." Maybe it's just the storm, Sarah said, but even she sounded less certain now. But as they sat in silence, trying to make sense of what was happening, the whispers began to grow louder. They didn't just call their names. They spoke other words, murmurs of phrases, half-heard sentences that didn't make sense. They were disjointed, unintelligible, but they had a rhythmic quality, as if someone was chanting. Liam's heart raced. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong. "I'm going outside," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "We need to see what's going on. These whispers aren't just in our heads. Are you crazy?" Rachel hissed, her voice sharp with fear. "It's pouring out there, and it's dangerous. Whatever's out there, whatever's causing this, can't be real. We're just hearing things." But Liam couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something that had been watching them since they arrived. The group hesitated, but in the end, they couldn't ignore the urge to know what was behind the whispers. They bundled up and stepped out into the cold, rain-soaked night. As they made their way toward the center of the campground, the whispers grew more insistent, echoing around them like the rustling of unseen figures in the trees. The campfire pit was still the same, cold, abandoned, but as they walked deeper into the clearing, they began to notice strange markings on the trees. Symbols, carvings. Some of them looked old, very old, but others seemed fresher, as if someone had recently etched them into the bark. The markings formed a circle, and in the center of the ring, the ground was wet with something that wasn't just rain. Liam stepped forward, his foot splashing into the wet ground. He paused. A single footprint was visible in the mud, a footprint that was not human. It was large, wide, and had long, claw-like toes that seemed to end in jagged, sharp points. The print was deep, as though whatever made it had been heavy, unnaturally heavy. "That's not possible," Sarah whispered, backing away from the print in fear. Then above the howl of the wind came a voice. "Liam, Rachel, Sarah, Ethan." It was a growl now, deep and guttural, echoing through the forest with a resonance that sent chills down their spines. The whispers were no longer words. They were a warning, and then, as the storm raged around them, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, as if something immense was stirring beneath the earth. Liam turned to run, but before he could make a move, a shadow swept across the clearing, faster than any human could move. The whispering voices rose to a deafening crescendo, calling their names, and then everything went silent. The storm was gone, and they were alone in the forgotten campground where no one had been in years. Story 10. The Raging Tree. The rain fell in sheets, torrential and unyielding, as the group of campers huddled beneath their tent. The wind howled like a wounded animal, whipping the forest into a frenzy. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the thick canopy above them. But amidst the chaos of the storm, there was one constant: the ancient tree that stood at the edge of their campsite, its towering branches stretching toward the heavens like skeletal arms. Liam, Sarah, Ethan, and Rachel had chosen this spot after hours of hiking, drawn to the majesty of the tree. Its trunk was massive, gnarled and twisted, with roots that seemed to crawl across the ground like serpents. The tree looked old, impossibly old, and it felt as if it had witnessed centuries of storms, growth, and decay. But now, in the middle of the worst storm any of them had ever encountered, the tree's presence felt ominous, as if it was something more than a mere part of the landscape. "I don't like this," Rachel muttered, pulling her jacket tighter around herself as she stared nervously at the tree. "It's like it's watching us." Ethan laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, it's just a tree. Trees don't watch people. We're fine." But his words seemed hollow, even to him. There was something unsettling about the way the tree loomed over them. It felt as though it was alive in some way that couldn't be explained. Liam, who had been scanning the forest, suddenly stopped. "Do you guys hear that?" The others fell silent, listening. At first, it was just the sound of the rain pounding on the ground, the wind howling through the branches, and the occasional crack of thunder. But then, in the midst of it all, there was another noise, a deep, resonant cracking sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the ancient tree. The sound was unmistakable, a sharp, loud crack, as if the tree's trunk were splitting in half. The group looked up at the tree, and for a moment, everything seemed still. But then, without warning, the cracking sound came again, louder this time, followed by a deep rumble from within the tree itself. "Okay, that's not normal," Liam said, his voice edged with concern. "This isn't just the storm. Something's wrong with that tree." Before anyone could respond, there was a strange movement in the trunk of the tree. At first, it seemed like the tree was swaying in the wind, but the motion was too deliberate, too unnatural. The massive tree began to shake violently, its roots groaning against the earth as if it were struggling to free itself from the ground. Sarah's eyes widened. What the hell is happening? The wind picked up, and with it came an eerie, low creaking sound. The tree seemed to be alive, its branches twisting and thrashing in the air, its roots undulating beneath the soil as if they were trying to escape. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something darker, something fetid. And then the first root shot up from the ground, twisting and writhing like a snake, its surface slick with moisture. The campers jumped back in shock, staring at the root as it arched and dug into the ground with unnatural force. "Is this for real?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Suddenly, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. The rain fell harder, and the air was charged with an electric tension. A low, rumbling sound reverberated through the forest, like a growl deep within the earth. And then, without warning, one of the roots lashed out with terrifying speed. Rachel screamed as the root coiled around her ankle, jerking her off her feet with such force that she was thrown to the ground. "Help!" she cried, her voice panicked and filled with terror. "Get it off me!" Liam and Ethan rushed forward, but before they could reach her, The root tightened its grip, pulling her toward the tree. Her screams echoed through the storm as the root dragged her, dragging her closer to the gnarled trunk of the tree. "No!" Liam shouted, throwing himself forward. He grabbed at the root, trying to pry it off, but it was like trying to break steel. The root wouldn't budge. It continued to drag Rachel, inch by inch, closer to the tree's massive trunk. "Rachel, no!" Sarah cried, her voice breaking as she watched in horror. With one last desperate pull, the root yanked Rachel toward the tree, and in a flash, she was gone. Her body was swallowed by the tree's dark, gaping trunk, vanishing into the twisted wood as if it had never been there. The group stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Rachel was gone, and the tree, now eerily still again, stood silent, as if it had never moved. What the hell just happened? Ethan breathed, his face pale with fear. Liam stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't find words. The reality of what had just transpired was impossible to grasp. How could a tree, a living thing, just take someone like that? The storm was relentless, the rain pouring down in sheets, but the terror that had seized their hearts was colder than the downpour. Liam looked toward the tree's gnarled roots, still pulsing with a faint, unnatural energy. The cracks in its trunk had faded, but the fear that gripped him only grew stronger. "Rachel's gone," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to leave. We need to get out of here." Liam nodded, feeling the weight of the decision heavy on his chest. But as he turned to gather his things, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A whisper. It came from the tree. "Liam, Sarah, Ethan." The voice was low, guttural, like the very bark of the tree was speaking. The campers froze, their blood running cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was the tree, somehow communicating with them, and it knew their names. Ethan grabbed Liam's arm, his grip tight with panic. "We have to go. Now." But as they turned to flee, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, and more roots shot up from the earth, reaching out like fingers of death, grabbing at their legs. "No!" Liam screamed, fighting against the roots that tangled around his ankles, pulling him toward the tree. "Get off me!" Sarah struggled to free herself, but the roots were everywhere, wrapping around their legs, pulling them closer to the monstrous trunk. The wind howled louder, as if the very forest itself was closing in on them, trapping them in its deadly grasp. The tree seemed to be alive, its branches swaying and twisting as if it were relishing their fear. And then, above the howling wind, came another sound, the unmistakable cracking of wood. The tree was stretching, growing, moving toward them. The campers struggled, their bodies dragged toward the trunk, but the roots only tightened their hold. It was as if the tree was feeding on their fear, growing stronger with each passing second. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Liam reached for his knife, but the roots jerked him forward with such force that he lost his grip. As he was pulled toward the tree, he saw Sarah and Ethan, both desperately clawing at the soil, trying to break free. The last thing Liam saw was the dark, twisted trunk of the tree opening wider, its bark splitting like a mouth, ready to swallow them whole. And then all was silent. The rain continued to pour, and the wind howled through the forest, but the clearing was empty now, save for the ancient, ominous tree. Its roots lay still, and its trunk stood silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But in the darkened wood, there was no escape. The storm raged on, and the tree waited, as it always had,